Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and the lighting, it's actually getting a little bit better. I'm figuring it out so it doesn't make me quite as jerky, maybe in video quality as opposed to personality, that we have seen in some of the previous ones. So hopefully this will be a little bit better visual quality for you. I am your host, of course, Nathan P. Butler of the Star Wars Timeline Gold, the most comprehensive Star Wars chronology available anywhere, and, of course, of Star Wars Beyond the Films with Mark Herleman over at StarWarsReport.com, podcast for EU fans. We have finally reached, in our ongoing saga following the Star Wars Expanded Universe growing through its publication order, approximate publication order, to the first Star Wars Expanded Universe novel. As you may recall, we started out this series with a look at the A New Hope novelization, that is, this book right here, if you're talking about the original paperback edition, which is how it was originally released, or this in its original Sci-Fi Book Club hardback release, which was a book that was written by Alan Dean Foster, albeit credited to George Lucas. It was ghost-written. Alan Dean Foster came back and wrote for Star Wars 2 more times in novel form. Most recently, he wrote 2002's The Approaching Storm, which takes place immediately before the events of Attack of the Clones. Before that, however, he is probably best known as the man who wrote the very first Star Wars Expanded Universe novel ever. Early on, Del Rey, same people who have the license right now, at least for the foreseeable future until the whole things with Disney shake out and we see what happens there. Del Rey had the Star Wars license prior to it going to Bantam and then back to Del Rey again. Their very first Star Wars EU novel was actually something that was meant to be essentially a low-budget sequel to the first Star Wars film if it hadn't done quite as good as it did in theaters. It was going to be a story that had to reuse a lot of the props, have some relatively low-budget settings, and only use cast members who are expected to return contractually, which means that Han Solo, sorry, since Harrison Ford wasn't contracted yet, he's out of there. No Han Solo in the book. The book itself is called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, not to be confused with Spectre of the Past. For some reason, some people get those confused from time to time. This is the original printing of this from back in February of 1978. It features, of course, that classic cover, Darth Vader there with Luke and Leia on the ground, and the red glow here is the Kyber crystal. Now, fans of the Clone Wars may have heard that phrase Kyber crystal recently a couple of times and might think this is the same thing. Not so much, but there is a connection as we're going to get to here. Again, this is the original 1978 paperback. Just like all the Del Rey Star Wars books from that era of Del Rey, they are all first released in paperback. They are not being first released as hardbacks. However, there is a hardback edition, again, only available through the Sci-Fi Book Club at the time. My copy just happens to be also signed, as was that omnibus of mine, by Alan Dean Foster himself. Back in 2004, I was doing a podcast called Chrono Radio, which you can still find at starwarsfanworks.com/chronoradio.html. Check out the link down there at the bottom. You'll be able to find it. Now, in interview edition number 18 of that series, I sat down with Rich Sigfrit, Ron, and Janine Garner at Con Carolina's 2004. They were hosting the show Requiem of the Outcast at the time. Rich had convinced me to go to Con Carolina's for the first time, and we had a chance to sit down with the writer guest of honor, who was Alan Dean Foster. So imagine us sitting around inside a hotel room with Rich's camera sitting on the table with it picking up the audio and basically filming everyone's knees for an interview with a guy in an era when podcasting wasn't very big, and he really probably had no idea who we really were and why he was there. This is the interview in which I asked the classic "What's a duck?" question from A New Hope's novelization, at which point he looked at me like I was from Mars or something. So I had a chance to interview him about this. If you want to hear that interview, it's a 2-part thing, part on their show, part on mine, but they're both linked off that same page over at StarWarsFanWorks.com. He was in an interesting position here. He had to write something that was essentially a follow-up to Star Wars, even though the film did become a phenomenal success. So it's a low-budget sequel to something that really didn't need a low budget for a sequel. What we get here is a story where Luke and Leia are going towards Serkarpuus, man, that's a hard word to say, 4, and wind up crashing on the planet Mimban. Luke in an X-Wing, Leia in a Y-Wing. Why? Because they could reuse the same models that they had from the previous film. They wind up crashing down, and they find that the Empire is essentially mining for energy and such there. They wind up finding this labor camp and that sort of thing, this station that the Imperials have set up, where they're oppressing some of the natives. They run into the natives, kind of very almost an Avatar-ish type of feel to some of it. And eventually, we find that there is this woman named Hala. And Hala is out there looking for a thing called the Kyber, K-A-I-B-U-R-R, crystal. She's got a shard of it. It's this little red crystal, and what the crystal does is it amplifies the force sensitivity in an individual and gives them extra abilities, essentially pumps them up. For instance, in this, they've used that as the excuse for why Darth Vader is able to use force lightning in this, when most other sources say no, because he's more machine than man, he can't do that, he would fry himself. They wind up in essentially a race against the Imperials to find this Kyber crystal, because eventually Darth Vader winds up on the planet as well. And we wind up with this classic confrontation that is the first time, at least print-wise, what would be the first time we see in print a battle between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader with lightsabers, something that was hinted at on the covers of the Marvel adaptation of the film, even though, yeah, that never happened on film. What we get here is essentially Leia winds up taking Luke's lightsaber, stands up to Vader, isn't able to get very far in the duel. Luke winds up getting the lightsaber and fights against Vader, eventually cutting off his right arm, right? The same one that we now know is, cybernetic. They didn't know it was cybernetic at the time, they just cut his arm off. Though it looks cybernetic in the comic adaptation, which we'll talk about later. They did a comic adaptation of this back in 1995, 1996, but we're going to wind up coming back to this when we get to that point in our coverage. So Luke duels Vader, is able to defeat Vader, at least fight him to a standstill, cut off his arm, and at one point in that duel, he says something along the lines of, "I am Obi-Wan." And they've used that to now be the excuse for why he was able to defeat Vader, that it's not actually Luke beating Vader in this story. Instead, the Kyber crystal is allowing Luke to essentially channel Obi-Wan's spirit, something we didn't know would necessarily be coming back in visual form in The Empire Strikes Back, that of course we had heard in A New Hope. So Obi-Wan's spirit is in a sense guiding Luke's hand, which is why he's able to defeat Vader, as Obi-Wan perhaps could have, rather than as Luke would not have been able to have done. So it makes for an oddball little item. And we have other continuity blips here and there that make this somewhat amusing. Of course, this is written before we knew that Luke and Leia were brother and sister. There's a lot of sexual tension between the two. It's toned down in the comic, but it is here in the novel. But of course, that naturally fits what they're thinking, because they didn't know. Not only did the writers not know, but Luke and Leia didn't know, so why would they know not to think that way? Although you would think there'd be some kind of instinctive force thing to say, "Whoa, incest isn't best, don't put your sister to the test." But yet, they're still a little bit flirtatious, so to speak, in here. We also have an instance in which Luke somehow says that he's able to swim, but Leia isn't able to swim. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense with Alderaan versus Tatooine. We will see that in another publication around the exact same time this is being released, they said the exact opposite. But that'll be in our next episode of this video series here. I want to also note, we have another continuity issue in this particular book, and this is one that wasn't created by something later or a contradiction with the comics that aren't really meant to fit with the novels. This is a contradiction directly with the movie. Darth Vader's lightsaber in this book is blue. Blue. Yeah. The explanation that's been given for this, among other places on Wikipedia is, well, you see, it's just because of how washed out the coloring was in the original prints of A New Hope that went out to theaters. Maybe they just didn't realize it was meant to be red, not blue. Okay, so by they, are you meaning even Lucasfilm themselves? Lucas, perhaps? Did nobody look at this and say, "Why is it blue?" Yeah, someone dropped the ball somewhere. One of our first major continuity with the film's gaffes in the expanded universe materials, if you don't count all the different contradictions in the film adaptations that were made while the film was still being made. But those at least have that excuse. It's an odd one, but it fits with what you would have expected for a low-budget sequel, and it's really kind of cool to see where Star Wars would have gone if they had not been quite as successful in the box office with the first film. Now, I mentioned the Kyber crystal here. This is an idea from back in some of the early script drafts of Star Wars, a crystal that helped one use the Force as opposed to you being able to use the Force without it. It wound up getting dropped from some of the different treatments and stuff that Lucas was doing, but then it was picked up again and used here. In-universe, this Kyber crystal would seem like the thing to be an ultimate weapon for Force users. Fortunately, they found a way to explain away why it never showed up again in the Star Wars saga. Main reason being, the thing's just too freaking powerful. Their explanation is, well, you see, the further it gets from the Temple of Pomajima where it was found, the less powerful it is. So unless you want to fight on Mimban using the Force, it's not going to really be all that useful to you. However, they've also said that shards of this thing wound up being in part of a lightsaber that Leia Organa Solo winds up building. It winds up being something Luke uses as a training device, and the piece that Vader gets his hand on, in fact, apparently it's pieces, plural, winds up being part of the light whip used by Dark Lady Lumaya, who of course appears in the Legacy of the Force novels and first appeared in the Marvel Comics, which is kind of an interesting play-in that I believe was Abel Pena put in there through the Emperor's Pawns, an article quite a while back. So, in terms of does it continue on in the EU? Yeah, kind of. There's not a lot of impact from this book, but, the Kyber crystal does continue on. However, when Lucas and Dave Filoni and the other members of the crew on the Clone Wars cartoon series were working up ideas for that series, they decided to bring back this term, Kyber. They almost did in Attack of the Clones. The Kamino Saber Dart was originally going to be a Kyber Dart. That's what it is in some of the adaptations, but it wound up being Kamino and Saber Dart in the film itself. But that same spelling they were going to use for that, not K-A-I-B-U-R-R, but K-Y-B-E-R, was used then for this, essentially a memory crystal that's used to unlock a holocron to get information about children with Force potential in the opening episodes of Season 2 of the Clone Wars cartoon series. Now, just around the time that this is being recorded, we're in the middle of the Young Jedi arc of the Clone Wars Season 5, and wouldn't you know it, Hondo Ohnaka, when he comes to Ilum trying to steal Jedi crystals, most of which in the EU from that planet would be called Adegan crystals, he's there saying he wants to get his hands on Kyber crystals. Now, does he realize that Kyber crystal refers to that memory core unlocking thing for the holocrons as opposed to a lightsaber crystal? Is it possible there are also Kyber, K-Y-B-E-R crystals on Ilum that can be used for lightsaber crystals along with the Adegan ones? There's sort of a continuity issue developing there, but they haven't said anything either way as to how it's going to play out or whether there's going to be any kind of retcon to make sense of it all. So it's an odd book, and its ramifications in the EU have been minor, but intriguing nonetheless, because this is something where it's not a ramification from a few years ago or from a few months ago. This is a ramification in 2012, going into 2013, that was in a book published back in 1978. Only a year, actually less than a year, after A New Hope hit theaters, and just over, a year and a half, I guess, after the novelization of A New Hope hit newsstands or hit bookstores. I gotta say, it's an odd one. So it comes down to our normal questions. Okay? Is this something that is an essential read? Can it be skipped? Is it an essential read? Absolutely not. There's nothing about this story you need to understand anything else. Although, if you are someone who is really into the idea of looking at early Star Wars and where it went, how it developed before the Thrawn trilogy ever came around, then yeah, in that sense, it's an essential read. It's an essential part of Star Wars publishing history. It's just not an essential part of the expanded universe. From the standpoint of whether or not you can skip it, well, obviously if it's not essential, I just kind of downplayed it there quite a bit, yeah, you can skip this thing and not miss a thing. It's just an intriguing little oddball part of the Star Wars EU development cycle. Come back next time for what happens next in the Marvel Comics series, around the same time that this was being released, and during which we have one of our first EU direct continuity contradictions. Oh joy. As always, thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.